The note, left on the polished granite of our kitchen island, was a masterpiece of casual cruelty, written in my wife Isabella's elegant, looping script on a piece of her ridiculously expensive, personalized stationery. Dearest Thomas, it began, the salutation itself a small, sharp barb of insincerity. I'm afraid I simply can't do this anymore. Your life, our life, it's just too boring, too predictable. I need passion, adventure, spontaneity. I want to find it. I've taken the joint savings as a sort of severance package for my years of stultifying tedium. Don't try to find me. My solicitor will be in touch. Yours, regretfully, but not really, Isabella. My name is Thomas Albright, 54 years old, and, until that precise moment, I had considered myself a reasonably successful, if perhaps somewhat conventional man. For 30 years, I have been a senior actuary at a major insurance firm, a profession that, I will concede, is not generally synonymous with high adventure or spontaneous passion. My world revolves around the meticulous analysis of risk, the prediction of long-term outcomes based on vast data sets, the quiet, satisfying logic of probability theory. Boring? Perhaps, to some, but also stable, secure, and, in its own way, profoundly important. I read the note a second time, a strange sense of calm, almost of detached, analytical interest settling over me. The emotional devastation, the grief, the anger, those would come later, I was sure, like a delayed onset claim. But my immediate primary reaction was that of an actuary reviewing a flawed risk assessment. Isabella's move, her spontaneous flight in search of passion, was, in fact, not spontaneous at all. It was a predictable, if rather dramatic, outcome based on a long series of observable behavioral anomalies and escalating risk factors I had been quietly, and with a growing sense of grim inevitability, documenting for the better part of 2 years. She had underestimated me, profoundly. She saw me as Thomas the actuary, the quiet, predictable man who balanced spreadsheets and calculated mortality tables, the man she had so casually dismissed as boring. She had forgotten, or perhaps never truly understood, that my entire profession is based on understanding and preparing for the long-term consequences of seemingly small, insignificant choices. I had, in essence, been running a long-term risk analysis on our marriage for some time, and the data had strongly indicated a high probability of catastrophic failure. What Isabella, in her haste to abscond with our joint savings and her new, presumably more exciting, life, had also forgotten was that my quiet, boring life had afforded me certain advantages. My conservative, long-term investment strategy, the one she had so often derided as unadventurous, had resulted in a personal portfolio entirely separate from our joint accounts that was considerably more substantial than she could ever have imagined. And my professional network, while not filled with the flamboyant artists and self-proclaimed gurus she so admired, included some of the sharpest legal and financial minds in the city, men and women who understood the intricate beauty of a well-drafted contract and the unassailable power of a meticulously documented paper trail. I walked over to the kitchen window, which overlooked the small, perfectly manicured garden I had so painstakingly cultivated, a place of quiet order and predictable seasonal rhythms. Isabella had always hated the garden, finding its slow, patient unfolding as tedious as my actuarial tables. She had wanted a deck, a hot tub, a place for loud, boisterous parties. The garden, like me, was too quiet, too predictable. I took a slow sip of the lukewarm coffee I had made an hour earlier, in what I now realized was the final, quiet morning of my old life. Then I picked up my phone. My first call was not to my children, not to a friend, not even to a lawyer. It was to a number I had not dialed in over 30 years, a number I knew by heart, a number that connected me to a part of my life, a part of my own history that Isabella had never known, had never even suspected, a part of my life that was anything but boring, a part of my life that was about to become very significant, and for Isabella, a very unwelcome variable in her carefully calculated departure. "Alistair," I said, when a familiar, gravelly voice answered on the other end of the line. "It's Thomas Albright. Yes, it's been a while. Listen, I have a situation here. A rather complex risk assessment has just come to fruition, and I believe I may require the services of your particular brand of an _actuarial consulting. Yes, it involves an unexpected withdrawal, a rather significant one." A slow smile touched my lips, the first genuine emotion I had allowed myself to feel since reading Isabella's note. She wanted passion, adventure, spontaneity. She had no idea that the boring man she had just abandoned was about to reintroduce a level of all three into her life that would make her head spin. The door she had so dramatically closed behind her was about to be reopened, and the person standing on the other side would be someone she never, in her wildest, most adventurous dreams, could ever have expected. The predictable man was about to become a very unpredictable problem. My marriage to Isabella had been, for its first decade, a study in comfortable, if not exactly electrifying, companionship. We had met at university, she a vibrant, ambitious art history major, I a quiet, mathematically inclined student lost in the elegant certainties of actuarial science. I had been drawn to her sparkle, her effortless social grace, her ability to fill a room with her laughter and her opinions. She, I believe, had been drawn to my stability, my quiet adoration, my clear and predictable path toward a secure, comfortable future. For a time, it had worked. I provided the solid, reliable foundation. She provided the decorative, often dramatic, superstructure. We raised two wonderful children, a son and a daughter, who were now grown and successfully launched into their own lives. We had a beautiful home, a wide circle of acquaintances, mostly hers, a life that, from the outside, looked like a perfect, textbook example of upper-middle-class contentment. The first hairline cracks in that foundation had appeared about 5 years ago, with the arrival of a charismatic, and I had always felt, rather predatory, life coach and creativity guru named Julian Vance into Isabella's social circle. Vance, a man with a suspiciously vague background and an inexhaustible supply of self-help platitudes, had quickly become Isabella's personal oracle. He had convinced her that she was a stifled creative genius, a passionate soul trapped in a world of beige predictability, and that her life with me, her quiet, dependable actuary husband, was a primary impediment to her true self-actualization. Her coaching sessions with Vance, which were ruinously expensive and, I suspected, involved more ego-stroking than actual guidance, became more frequent. Her talk became peppered with his insufferable jargon, manifesting my reality, living my authentic truth, embracing a paradigm of limitless possibility. My own, more grounded, reality of risk assessment, long-term planning, and fiscal prudence was increasingly dismissed as negative energy, as a scarcity mindset, as the very embodiment of the boring life she was now so desperate to escape. The warning signs, the actuarial red flags, began to accumulate. The unexplained expenditures on her credit card statements, expensive wellness retreats that seemed to coincide with Vance's own travel schedule, large cash withdrawals for creative project supplies that never seemed to materialize into any actual projects. The hushed, late-night phone calls, the sudden, almost religious devotion to a new, more adventurous style of yoga. The way she had begun to subtly, then more overtly devalue our shared life, our history, me. I had, of course, begun to take precautions, not out of malice, but out of a professional, ingrained habit of risk mitigation. I had quietly and entirely legally begun to restructure my personal assets, the ones I had inherited from my own parents and the ones I had accumulated through my own separate premarital investments. I had established a series of discreet, legally sound trusts managed by my old university friend and now trusted solicitor, Alastair Sterling, a man whose understanding of financial fortifications was second to none. Our joint assets, the ones Isabella had so triumphantly absconded with, were in fact only a fraction of my true net worth, a carefully calculated, and I now realized, entirely acceptable loss. But the true contingency plan, the one I had just activated with my phone call, was of a different and far more personal nature. The man I had called, Alastair Thorne, was not a solicitor, not a financial advisor. He was something else entirely. Alastair Thorne and I had known each other a lifetime ago, at a time in my life Isabella knew nothing about. Before I was Thomas Albright, the quiet actuary, I had been, for a brief, intense, and largely untalked about period, Lieutenant Thomas Albright of a specialized military intelligence unit, a unit that dealt not in conventional warfare, but in the far murkier world of cryptography, counterespionage, and risk mitigation of a very different and often very final kind. My aptitude for mathematics, for pattern recognition, for calm, logical analysis under extreme pressure, had made me exceptionally good at it. Alastair Thorne had been my commanding officer, a man whose reputation in that shadowy world was legendary, a man who could, as he once drily put it, persuade a locked safe to reveal its innermost secrets, or a recalcitrant foreign agent to reveal his. We had served together in several difficult situations in various inhospitable corners of the globe. We had saved each other's lives on more than one occasion. We had forged a bond of absolute, unspoken trust, a bond that transcended time and circumstance. When I had left that life behind, seeking the quiet, predictable certainty of the actuarial world, a world where the risks were calculated on paper, not in the field, Alastair had understood. "You've seen enough, Thomas," he'd said, his voice unusually gentle. "Go build yourself a quiet life. But remember, the skills you've learned, they don't just disappear. And if you ever need a specialist consultation, you have my number." Alastair had retired a few years after me, establishing a highly discreet and phenomenally successful private security and corporate intelligence firm in London, a firm that specialized in complex problem-solving for a very select and very wealthy clientele. My text to him, "I have a situation, an unexpected withdrawal. I may require your services," was a coded message he would have understood instantly. It was a request for a full-scale, deep-cover investigation into Isabella, into Julian Vance, into their finances, their plans, their every move. It was an activation of a set of skills, a network of resources that Isabella, in her world of scented candles and self-help seminars, could not even begin to comprehend. She thought she had left her boring, predictable husband for a life of passion and adventure with a charismatic guru. She had no idea she had just made an enemy of a man who had once, quite literally, written the book on tactical surveillance and psychological warfare. And she certainly had no idea that my boring life had been a deliberate choice, a quiet haven I had built for myself after a career that had been anything but. The note on the kitchen island was an act of profound disrespect, of breathtaking betrayal. But it was also a critical error in her risk assessment. She had calculated the response of Thomas Albright, the actuary. She had failed entirely to factor in the potential response of Lieutenant Thomas Albright, retired, of Her Majesty's clandestine services. And that, I knew with a cold, hard certainty, was a miscalculation that was going to cost her dearly. The passion and adventure she so desperately craved were indeed coming her way. But they would arrive in a form she had never, in her wildest, most self-actualized dreams, anticipated. The game had changed, and the quiet man she had abandoned was about to demonstrate that the most dangerous risks are often the ones you never see coming. While Alastair Thorne's discreet, but I knew, ruthlessly efficient, team in London began the process of untangling the financial and personal web of Isabella and Julian Vance, my own immediate task was to manage the domestic front, to present a facade of the heartbroken, abandoned husband, a performance designed to lull Isabella into a false sense of security, and to provide a clear, consistent narrative for our concerned, and soon-to-be, I was sure, rather intrusive, friends and family. My first call was to our children, a conversation I dreaded. Our son, Michael, a junior doctor in Manchester, was pragmatic, his reaction a mixture of anger at his mother and a deep, quiet concern for me. "Dad, are you okay? I always knew that Vance fellow was a charlatan. Is there anything I can do?" Our daughter, Sarah, a postgraduate art history student in Edinburgh, a field of study she had, with a certain ironic symmetry, chosen in part due to her mother's early influence, was more emotional, her voice cracking with a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, bitter disillusionment with the mother she had, for so long, idolized. I reassured them both that while I was, of course, deeply hurt, I was also handling it. I asked them not to contact Isabella directly, explaining that it was best to let the solicitors handle all communication for now, a request they both, reluctantly, agreed to. Then came the more challenging conversations, with Isabella's parents, Gregory and Beatrice, and with her sister, Cassandra. Gregory's reaction was predictable, a sputtering, incoherent rage, directed not at his daughter for her betrayal, but at me, for somehow failing to keep her happy. "Damn it, Thomas," he boomed down the phone line. "A man is supposed to provide for his wife, to keep her engaged. This is a failure of management on your part, son. A complete failure." Beatrice, by contrast, had dissolved into a puddle of tearful, self-pitying despair, her primary concern, it seemed, being the social humiliation this would cause. "Oh, Thomas, what will people think? A separation at our age. It's just so unseemly. Can't you just talk to her? Persuade her to come back? For the sake of appearances, if nothing else." Cassandra, Isabella's younger sister, a woman whose life was a perpetual drama of her own making, was, predictably, the least helpful of all, her conversation a whirlwind of breathless, gossipy inquiries and thinly veiled schadenfreude. Through it all, I maintained a consistent narrative, that I was shocked, heartbroken, and utterly bewildered by Isabella's sudden departure. I played the part of the wronged, abandoned husband to perfection, my quiet, understated demeanor easily mistaken for a grief-stricken paralysis. They all, in their own ways, bought it. They saw what they expected to see. Thomas the actuary, the boring, predictable man, poleaxed by a life event for which his tables and charts had no answer. None of them suspected the cold, analytical engine that was whirring away beneath the surface, the quiet, methodical process of data acquisition and strategic planning that was already in full swing. The first report from Alastair Thorne's team arrived 3 days later, in a heavily encrypted file delivered via a secure, anonymous server. It was a masterpiece of corporate and personal intelligence. Julian Vance, as I had suspected, was a financial house of cards. He had a string of failed businesses, a number of disgruntled former clients who had lost significant sums in his investment schemes, and a series of outstanding debts to some rather unsavory lenders who were known for their particularly aggressive collection methods. His charm, his guru-like pronouncements, his carefully cultivated image of effortless affluence. It was all a fragile, glittering facade built on a foundation of other people's money. The report also contained a detailed breakdown of Isabella's finances. In the 2 years since she had fallen under Vance's spell, she had not only depleted her own inheritance, but had also, it appeared, systematically siphoned funds from our joint savings account, the very account she had so triumphantly emptied upon her departure, to the tune of nearly £100,000, long before her final, dramatic withdrawal. The transactions were cleverly disguised as payments to a series of shell companies, all of which, Alastair's team had discovered, were directly linked to Julian Vance. She hadn't just left me. She had been systematically defrauding me for 2 years, using our shared resources to fund her lover's predatory schemes and her own increasingly extravagant lifestyle. The report also included preliminary surveillance data. Isabella and Vance were not, as she had vaguely implied, on some spontaneous spiritual quest for passion and adventure. They were holed up in a luxury, long-let apartment in a fashionable district of Paris, an apartment leased and paid for 6 months in advance by one of Vance's shell companies, using funds that could be traced directly back to my and Isabella's joint account. Their spontaneous flight was, in fact, a carefully planned, pre-funded, strategic relocation. Armed with this new, irrefutable evidence, I contacted my own solicitor, the other Alastair in my life, Alastair Sterling. Alistair, I said, my voice calm, I believe we now have sufficient grounds to proceed. I want you to file for divorce immediately on the grounds of adultery and financial malfeasance. And I want you to petition the court for an ex parte emergency asset freeze, not just on what remains of our joint accounts, but on any and all known assets held by Ms. Isabella Albright, née Hayes, and her associate, Mr. Julian Vance. I have reason to believe they are actively engaged in the dissipation of marital assets. I then forwarded him a redacted, but sufficiently damning summary of Thorne's intelligence report. Alistair Sterling, a man not easily impressed, let out a low whistle. Good heavens, Thomas, he said. This is comprehensive and deeply, deeply foolish on our part. An emergency asset freeze should be no problem at all, given this evidence. They've practically gift-wrapped the case for us. The legal machinery began to turn. The divorce petition was filed. The application for the asset freeze was submitted. The first shots in my quiet, meticulously planned counteroffensive have been fired. In Paris, Isabella and Julian Vance were no doubt enjoying a croissant and a café au lait. Blissfully unaware that their financial world, their carefully constructed bubble of stolen luxury, was about to be, with a single, court-ordered keystroke, frozen solid. The actuary, the man who calculated risk for a living, had decided that the time for passive observation was over. The risk presented by Isabella and Julian Vance was no longer a future probability. It was a clear and present danger, and it was about to be neutralized. The ex parte asset freeze, granted by the court with a speed that spoke volumes about the strength of our preliminary evidence, was a thing of legal and logistical beauty. Alistair Sterling, working in concert with a team of international banking lawyers, executed it with the precision of a coordinated military strike. Within hours, every known account held by Isabella, by Julian Vance, and by their various interconnected shell companies was frozen solid, their access to funds, both marital and misappropriated, abruptly and comprehensively severed. The effect, as relayed to me a day later by a rather gleeful Alistair Thorne, whose team in Paris was discreetly monitoring their movements, was dramatic. The first indication that something was amiss for Isabella and Vance came when their joint credit card was declined at a particularly exclusive Parisian boutique where Isabella had been attempting to purchase a handbag whose price rivaled the GDP of a small island nation. The initial annoyance had, according to Thorne's surveillance report, quickly morphed into confusion, then dawning panic, as a series of subsequent attempts to access their funds through various cards and online banking portals were met with the same implacable digital wall of rejection. Their carefully planned, pre-funded Parisian idol had just hit a rather large and entirely unforeseen financial iceberg. The ensuing audio snippets, captured by Thorne's team from a discreet listening post near their apartment, were a symphony of recrimination and despair. Isabella, it seemed, was blaming Vance for his flawed financial planning. Vance, in turn, was accusing Isabella of having understated the vindictiveness of her boring actuary husband. Their shared dream of limitless abundance had, it appeared, evaporated with astonishing speed, replaced by the grim, mundane reality of a dwindling supply of cash and a rapidly mounting hotel bill they could no longer pay. While they were descending into their Parisian panic, I was engaged in a far more constructive activity. I was meticulously cataloging our shared marital assets, preparing for the inevitable and now significantly rebalanced divorce settlement negotiations. This included not just our primary residence, our investment portfolios, our art and antiques, but also a rather unique asset that Isabella had, in her arrogance, likely forgotten about or dismissed as another of my boring, sentimental eccentricities. Years ago, my grandfather, a man of quiet passions and considerable, if discreet, wealth, had bequeathed to me his entire collection of rare, 19th-century scientific instruments, exquisite brass microscopes, gleaming celestial globes, intricate auroras, and beautifully crafted chronometers. The collection, which I had cherished and quietly added to over the years, was not just of immense sentimental value to me. It was also, as I knew from recent appraisals I had commissioned for insurance purposes, of considerable and rapidly appreciating monetary value. A value that ran well into 7 figures. A value that Isabella had never shown the slightest interest in, dismissing it as your collection of dusty, old brass things. A value that was, however, legally considered a marital asset, as it had been housed and maintained within our shared home throughout our marriage, and I had never taken the step of formally sequestering it in a trust, as I had with my financial investments. A small, almost insignificant oversight on my part, or so it would have seemed. My plan, formulated with the cunning legal mind of Alastair Sterling, was simple, elegant, and deliciously ironic. In our initial settlement offer, we would propose a straightforward 50-50 division of all declared marital assets. However, we would also propose that, in the spirit of an equitable and non-contentious distribution of physical property, Isabella could have her choice of either a 50% share of the liquid financial assets, our savings, investments, etc., or sole ownership of the collection of dusty old brass things, whose value we would, for the purposes of this initial offer, modestly and entirely disingenuously, estimate at a few £1,000s, based on its sentimental and decorative value. Alone, it was a trap, a beautifully baited trap, designed to play directly into Isabella's and Vance's primary weaknesses, their greed, their ignorance, and their profound, contemptuous dismissal of anything whose value was not immediately apparent or easily converted into cash. They would see the choice as an insult, a transparent attempt on my part to fob them off with a collection of worthless old junk while I retained the real money. They would, I was certain, angrily reject the collection and demand their 50% share of the liquid assets, thereby legally and irrevocably relinquishing any and all future claim to the scientific instruments. And in doing so, they would be unwittingly walking away from a fortune far greater than the one they believed they were fighting for. The trap was set. The bait was laid. Now, all we had to do was wait for the targets to stumble into it. Alastair Sterling presented our initial settlement offer to Isabella's new solicitor, Bartholomew Thorne having been summarily dismissed in a fit of pique after the asset freeze debacle. A rather overwhelmed-looking young man who clearly had no idea of the legal and financial shark-infested waters he was now navigating. The reaction, when it was relayed to Isabella and Vance in their rapidly cooling Parisian love nest, was, according to Thorne's report, predictable. There was outrage. There were accusations of my being a cheap, vindictive old man. There was a formal and deeply indignant rejection of my insulting offer of the scientific instrument collection. And there was a firm, non-negotiable demand for their 50% share of all liquid assets to be unfrozen and transferred immediately. Alastair Sterling received their counteroffer with a polite, almost apologetic acceptance. Of course, his letter to their solicitor read, "My client, Mr. Albright, had hoped Ms. Albright might wish to retain certain items of sentimental value from the marriage. But he understands and respects her desire for a clean financial break. We accept your client's proposal. She shall relinquish all claims to the collection of scientific instruments, and in return will receive her 50% share of the declared marital liquid assets, once a full and final forensic accounting has been completed and all misappropriated funds have been returned to the marital estate." The fish had not just taken a bait. They had swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. They had no idea that the sentimental items they had so contemptuously rejected were, in fact, the crown jewels of our shared estate. The boring actuary, the quiet man of numbers and probabilities, had just executed a flawless, an entirely legal, financial sleight of hand. The final accounting was yet to come, but the most significant and most valuable asset was now securely and irrevocably mine. The adventure Isabella had craved was about to take a rather sharp and financially disappointing detour. The quiet, predictable life she had so disdained, she was about to discover, had contained hidden depths and hidden values she had never even begun to comprehend. The final stages of the divorce settlement unfolded with the slow, grinding, and deeply satisfying inevitability of a glacier carving its path through a particularly resistant mountain of arrogance and deceit. Isabella and Julian Vance, their Parisian idyll having devolved into a nightmare of frozen credit cards and mounting hotel bills, were forced into a humiliating retreat back to London, their dreams of a life of effortless luxury comprehensively shattered. The forensic accounting, meticulously conducted by a team of specialists recommended by Alastair Sterling, laid bare the full extent of Isabella's financial infidelity. Every misappropriated pound, every siphoned-off investment in Vance's phantom enterprises was traced, documented, and presented to her legal team with irrefutable clarity. The final sum she was required to repay to the marital estate, before any division could occur, was staggering, effectively wiping out a significant portion of the very joint savings she had so triumphantly absconded with. Her legal team, faced with the overwhelming evidence and the very real threat of a separate civil suit for fraud, had no choice but to concede. The final settlement left Isabella with a sum that was, by any normal standard, still comfortable, but a pale, pathetic shadow of the vast fortune she had believed was within her grasp. She was forced to sell the expensive jewelry she had acquired during her spree, to relinquish the designer wardrobe, to exchange her aspirations of Parisian chic for the more prosaic reality of a small, rented flat in a respectable but decidedly unfashionable part of the city. Julian Vance, his primary source of funding now permanently disconnected, and his own finances under a new and rather unwelcome level of scrutiny from some of his other, less forgiving investors, reportedly faded into a well-deserved obscurity, his career as a charismatic Svengali of self-actualization definitively over. As for the collection of 19th-century scientific instruments, my dusty old brass things, their true value was, as planned, never disclosed during the divorce proceedings. Isabella, in her greed and her ignorance, had signed away any claim to them, content with what she believed was the lion's share of our real wealth. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I made my next move, the final, quiet, and most satisfying phase of my long-term strategic plan. I contacted the curator of the Science Museum in London, a man with whom I had a long-standing professional acquaintance, and offered a loan, on a long-term, semi-permanent basis, a significant portion of my collection for a new, dedicated exhibition on the history of scientific instrumentation. The curator, upon seeing the preliminary catalog of the collection, was, to put it mildly, ecstatic. An exhibition of this caliber, featuring pieces of such rarity and historical significance, was a major coup, a once-in-a-generation opportunity. The exhibition, titled Instruments of Discovery, the Albright Collection, opened a year later to considerable critical acclaim and public fanfare. The press coverage was extensive. There were features in national newspapers, articles in glossy art and science magazines, even a rather well-produced documentary by a major broadcaster. And in every article, in every interview, I made a point of quietly, and with a carefully calibrated modesty, mentioning the collection's estimated insurance value, a figure that, when printed in black and white, was so staggeringly high that it caused a collective gasp in the city's financial and social circles. I did not, of course, send Isabella a personal invitation to the exhibition's grand opening. There was no need. The news, I knew, would reach her, as all significant social and financial news eventually did. I could only imagine her reaction as she read of the multi-million-pound valuation of the dusty old brass things she had so contemptuously rejected, the fortune she had so blithely and so irrevocably signed away in her haste to secure what she had believed to be the more valuable prize. The irony was exquisite, a perfect, elegant, and entirely self-inflicted financial checkmate. My old commanding officer, Alastair Thorne, who had followed the entire saga with a grim, professional amusement, sent me a one-word email after seeing a feature on the exhibition in the Financial Times, masterful. One evening, several months after the exhibition had opened, I was at a quiet dinner with my children, Michael and Sarah. They had, of course, been deeply hurt by their mother's actions, but they had also, with the resilience of youth and the benefit of a stable, loving father, weathered the storm. We were discussing their university plans, their futures, a conversation now unburdened by the financial anxieties and emotional manipulations of the past. "Dad," my son Michael said, a thoughtful expression on his face, "I was thinking about Mom. Do you think she ever regrets it? Not just the money, but everything." I considered his question for a long moment. "I don't know, Michael," I said honestly. "Your mother, she chose a path based on a very different set of values, a very different understanding of what constitutes a happy or a successful life. Whether she ever truly understands the value of what she threw away, that's a question only she can answer. My only concern, is that you and Sarah build your own lives on a more solid foundation. One based on integrity, on passion, on mutual respect, on the quiet, enduring satisfaction of work well done, of love honestly given." He nodded, a quiet understanding passing between us. The legacy I wanted to leave for my children was not one of wealth or of status or of a victory won in a bitter divorce. It was a legacy of resilience, of integrity, of the quiet strength that comes from knowing your own worth, even when others, even those closest to you, fail to see it. Isabella had left me because she thought I was too boring. She had mistaken my quiet, methodical nature for a lack of passion, my prudence for a lack of ambition. She had failed to see that beneath the calm, predictable surface of the actuary, there was a man of hidden depths, of quiet passions, of a strategic mind that, when provoked, was capable of a far more complex and far more devastating series of calculations than she could ever have imagined. The door she had so dramatically slammed behind her had indeed been reopened, and the life she had discovered on the other side, the life of thrilling spontaneity and passionate adventure she had craved, had turned out to be a rather bleak and financially disappointing landscape. My own life, the boring one she had so contemptuously abandoned, had, in the end, proven to be a far richer, far more secure, and infinitely more satisfying investment. The final actuarial tables of our marriage had been calculated, and the long-term outcome, I reflected with a quiet and entirely justified sense of peace, was decisively and conclusively in my favor. The years following the successful launch of the Instruments of Discovery exhibition at the Science Museum were a period of profound peace and quiet, intellectual fulfillment for me. The Albright collection became one of the museum's most celebrated permanent exhibits, drawing scholars and enthusiasts from around the world. I served as its honorary curator, a role that brought me immense joy, allowing me to share my passion and knowledge with a wider, more appreciative audience than I could ever have found in my old corporate life. The foundation I established in my parents' name, funded by a significant portion of my now considerable wealth, became a major benefactor for scientific education and historical preservation, a way to transform the assets I had so carefully protected into a force for public good. My children, Michael and Sarah, flourished. Michael pursued a career in medicine, his compassionate nature and sharp intellect, making him a gifted and dedicated physician. Sarah, after completing her studies in art history, surprised us all by finding her niche in museum curation. Her work at a major national gallery characterized by a keen eye, a deep appreciation for historical context, and an unwavering commitment to ethical stewardship, qualities that, I like to believe, were a quiet echo of my own professional values. They built happy, stable lives for themselves, their relationships based on mutual respect and shared values, a stark and welcome contrast to the dysfunctional dynamics they had witnessed in their parents' marriage. Of Isabella, I heard very little. Her name faded from the social pages, her presence from the lives of our former mutual acquaintances. She became a kind of cautionary tale, a ghost at the feast of the city's affluent social scene, a reminder of the perils of avarice and the fleeting nature of a life built on superficialities. The last I heard, many years later, from a solicitor acquaintance who had handled a minor legal matter for her, was that she was living a quiet, solitary life in a small coastal town, her grand ambitions long since extinguished, her days filled with the quiet, mundane rhythms of a life lived in the long shadow of past mistakes. There was no communication between us, no final confrontation, no dramatic reconciliation. Our story had concluded, not with a bang, but with the quiet, inexorable logic of an actuarial table, each of us arriving at a long-term outcome that was a direct and entirely predictable consequence of our respective choices, our respective values. One afternoon, while working in my study, surrounded by my books, my research, and the quiet, ticking presence of an antique chronometer I was restoring, I came across the file Alastair Sterling had prepared for my divorce. Tucked away at the back was a copy of Isabella's note, the one she had left on the kitchen island all those years ago. "I need passion, adventure, spontaneity," she had written. "I've gone to find it." I looked around my quiet, book-filled room, a space filled with the fruits of a lifetime of patient, dedicated, and deeply fulfilling work. I thought of my children, of their happiness, of their successful, meaningful lives. I thought of my quiet, comfortable companionship with a wonderful woman who valued my mind and my heart, not my bank balance. I thought of the legacy I was building through the museum, through the foundation, a legacy of knowledge, of preservation, of giving back. And I realized, with a profound sense of peace, that I, too, had found passion, adventure, and spontaneity. Not in the shallow, frantic pursuit of fleeting pleasures, but in the deep, quiet, and enduring satisfaction of a life well lived, a life built on a foundation of integrity, of purpose, and of an unwavering commitment to the things that truly matter. Isabella had left because she thought I was too boring. She had mistaken the quiet, steady rhythm of my life for a lack of excitement, the careful calculation of risk for a lack of courage. She had never understood that the greatest adventures are often the ones undertaken in the quiet landscapes of the mind, that the most profound passions are those that burn with a slow, steady, and enduring flame, and that the most satisfying spontaneity is that which is earned, the freedom that comes from a life built on a foundation of unshakable security and absolute, unapologetic self-knowledge. The door she had so dramatically closed had, in the end, opened onto a far richer, far more interesting, and infinitely more satisfying world for me. And that, in the final, quiet accounting of it all, was the most beautiful and most elegantly ironic calculation of all. The risk of her leaving had been high, but the return on my investment in myself, in my own integrity, had been, by any measure, immeasurable.